If you have ever sat in a quiet Paris cafe and suddenly noticed one specific table where the conversation is somehow filling the entire room, the table everyone else in the cafe is glancing toward, the table you do not even need to look at because you can hear every word of their conversation from across the building, you have already identified the second-order effect of this video. That table is almost always American. Not sometimes, almost always. Europeans living in tourist cities can identify Americans by sound before they identify them by sight. Italians joke about it. The French roll their eyes about it. Japanese travel forums actually warn American tourists about it before they visit. There is a long-running observation across the entire world that Americans speak at a volume the rest of the planet considers strange. Not rude exactly. Not always. Just noticeably, consistently, surprisingly loud. Here is what should bother you for the next 10 minutes. This is not random, and it is not a stereotype made up by people who do not like Americans. It is real, it is measurable, and it is the product of three completely different things that stacked on top of each other over 200 years to produce a national speaking style that the rest of the world genuinely cannot get used to. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why a country full of people who are not trying to be loud somehow produces the loudest average conversational volume on Earth, and why even Americans who travel to Europe and try to lower their voices often cannot, because the reason runs deeper than anyone realizes. Stay with me, because the third reason involves a single architectural fact about American buildings that quietly trained an entire population to talk over their own homes for 100 years. Here is the punchline up front. Americans are not loud because Americans are rude. They are loud because of three things stacked together that completely shaped national speaking volume. A frontier history that rewarded projection over subtlety. A service economy that turned loud confidence into a job requirement. And the architecture of American homes, restaurants, and cars, which trained generations of people to speak over the constant background noise their own buildings produce. Take any one of those three away and the volume gap closes noticeably. Take all three away, which is basically how most European cultures developed, and you get the quieter, lower, more contained conversational style that the rest of the developed world treats as ordinary indoor speaking. And here is the part most people never realize. Americans cannot easily hear themselves being loud. The volume calibration is internal. When everyone around you has spoken at a similar level your entire life, that volume becomes your 0 point. You do not register it as loud, because to you, it is just speaking. The contrast only becomes obvious when you step into a culture with a quieter 0 point and suddenly find yourself broadcasting. Hidden Systems explains the everyday things in homes and daily life that look like personal habits, but are actually the result of architecture, history, and economy long before any individual was born. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Now let me walk you back to where this starts, on the American frontier. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, the United States was an outdoor country, rural, spread out, loud by necessity. Farmers called across fields. Settlers shouted between wagons. Pioneers communicated over long distances without any of the soundproofed quiet that defined European city life. The American voice developed in open space, where projecting carried information and being quiet meant being ignored. European voices, especially in cities, developed in the opposite environment. Dense urban living. Apartments stacked on top of each other. Conversations that could be overheard through thin walls. Cafes packed so tightly together that being loud meant disturbing 6 other tables at once. The pressure was constantly toward containment. Speaking low was not just polite. It was structurally required by how everyone lived. These are not minor influences. Cultures inherit their baseline conversational volume from the physical environment their ancestors lived in for generations. Americans inherited the open field. Europeans inherited the shared wall. 2 centuries later, the voices still reflect the rooms they were trained in. First cause, the frontier rewarded projection. When the United States expanded westward in the 1800s, the people moving into those new spaces were operating in conditions where being heard mattered more than being subtle. Clear, projected, confident voice was a survival tool, calling out warnings. conducting business across markets, organizing collective labor outdoors. Across an entire continent of dispersed settlements, the people who carried best communicated best, and the ones who communicated best often did better economically. Here I have to admit something. When I started researching this, I assumed American loudness was just confidence or a cultural personality difference, the kind of thing you cannot explain structurally. The data forced me to throw that assumption out completely. The volume is not a personality trait. It is a regional inheritance carried across generations of people who grew up imitating the voices around them. Children calibrate their conversational baseline from the adults in their environment. If those adults speak at one level, that becomes the child's normal. After enough generations, the entire culture is locked into that baseline, even after the original environment that produced it has disappeared. The behavior did not precede the system. The environment trained at one level that becomes the child's normal. Second cause, the service economy turned loud confidence into a job requirement. This is the part that explains why American volume actually increased through the 20th century instead of fading as the country urbanized. Starting in the early 1900s, the American economy began shifting from manufacturing to service. By the late 20th century, more than 3/4 of all American jobs were in service industries: retail, restaurants, sales, customer support, hospitality, healthcare front desks, real estate. Every one of these jobs rewarded a specific style of communication: warm, confident, audible from across the room, energetic enough to be heard over a busy environment, friendly enough to be welcoming, projected enough to never sound uncertain. This style was actively taught. Sales training programs emphasized projection. Hospitality programs trained employees to greet customers from across a lobby. Retail managers coached staff to call out warm welcomes loud enough to be heard from the door. Service industries selected for and rewarded exactly the speaking style that European cultures associate with being too loud. Over decades, tens of millions of American workers received what amounted to formal volume training. Then they went home. They raised children. They modeled adult speaking volume for the next generation. The professional voice became the home voice, and then the public voice, and then the default voice. Generations of Americans now speak in a style that was originally designed to penetrate a noisy department store at the height of the 1980s, applied to every conversation everywhere. Third cause, American architecture trained people to talk over their own buildings. Here is the cause almost nobody knows. American homes, restaurants, cars, and offices are dramatically louder environments than their European equivalents. American houses use thinner construction materials, hardwood and tile floors that bounce sound, open floor plans that let conversations carry from kitchen to living room to dining room, HVAC systems that hum constantly in the background, big refrigerators that cycle audibly, larger cars with engines you can hear from inside the cabin, restaurants with hard surfaces specifically chosen because they increase the lively feel of the space, which is industry shorthand for makes everyone louder. European architecture historically went the other way. Thicker walls, smaller rooms, more fabric, quieter appliances, compact cars with smaller engines, restaurants with carpeted floors and upholstered booths that absorb sound. The whole built environment lowers the noise floor, which means people do not have to push their voices up to be heard. They can speak at conversational volume because the room is not fighting them. When the room is noisy by default, you raise your voice automatically to compensate. Do that for a lifetime in every room you ever enter, and you train yourself to a baseline speaking volume calibrated for noisy spaces. Then you step into a quiet European cafe, where the room itself is silent, and suddenly your normal speaking voice is filling the entire building. You did not get louder, the room got quieter, but the volume gap was set by the room you grew up in. Compare those two cafes for a second. An American diner has tile floors, an open kitchen with hood fans running, music playing, drinks rattling in cups, a baby crying at one table, conversations happening at 5 others, and a host calling out names by the door. To be heard at your own table, you have to push your voice up. A Paris cafe has carpeted floors, soft seating, No music, low background hum, and most patrons speaking at near whisper. To be heard at your own table, you barely have to project at all. Same activity. Same century of cafe culture. Two completely different acoustic environments demanding two completely different speaking volumes. One trained projection, the other trained restraint. Neither is wrong, but they are not interchangeable, and the people who grew up in each one carry their baseline volume with them everywhere they go for the rest of their lives. Stack those three causes: a frontier history that rewarded projection, a service economy that turned loud confidence into a job requirement, an architecture that trained generations to speak over their own buildings, and you get the modern American speaking voice. A volume so consistent that travelers from anywhere else in the world can identify it in a crowded room without seeing the speaker. So embedded that even Americans who consciously try to lower their voices in Europe often cannot, because the calibration is automatic. So invisible to the people doing it that most Americans genuinely do not know they sound different from anyone else. Now here is where it gets interesting. American volume is not uniform across the country. Regional patterns exist. The American Northeast tends to speak louder and faster, partly because of denser urban living that requires audibility through subway and traffic noise. The South tends slightly softer but still well above European averages. The West Coast trends a bit closer to European patterns in some urban areas, partly due to international influence. But every American regional baseline still sits above the average European baseline. The variation within America is smaller than the gap between America and most of Europe. There is one detail worth noting. The American volume gap is one of the few cultural differences that consistently shows up even in second-generation immigrants. Children born in the United States to quiet-speaking immigrant parents often grow up speaking at American volume by adulthood because they calibrate to their peers and their environment rather than to their parents. Read that backwards. The volume is not transmitted by family. It is transmitted by environment. Which means that even if you arrive in America speaking quietly, your children will likely arrive at the American baseline within one generation, because the buildings, the schools, the streets, and the workplaces will train them long before any other influence can. The cultural anthropologists who first studied American speech patterns assumed loudness was a personality stereotype that would gradually fade as the country urbanized and modernized. They could not have foreseen that the service economy would reinforce projection, that American architecture would consistently produce noisier rooms than European architecture, and that the loudness they thought was a fading frontier habit would instead be re-engineered into a permanent feature of how an entire country sounds. Every loud American table in a quiet European cafe is, in a small way, 200 years of frontier history, service training, and noisy architecture all speaking at the same time. Have you ever noticed yourself being the loud one in a quiet space abroad, or noticed an American table in a European cafe? What country were you in when it happened? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how universal this observation actually is across this channel. I read every single one.